My name is Beth Ekman. On behalf of the Honors Program, I would like to welcome you to our latest presenter. This is Jovahana Avila. Her mentor is Dr. Chad Long, and her thesis is What It Takes for Women of Color, a comparative analysis of women of color running in the Texas House of Representatives. This morning.
All right, so good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. So the Texas State Legislature held its first session in the spring of 1846. That was a pretty long time ago. And the first individual who identified as a woman was elected in 1922. But what if I told you for the majority of history, the Texas State Legislature, and in fact all our elected bodies, have been male-dominated? That's no surprise to everyone. But what if I told you that in the 173-year history of the Texas State Legislature, there has only ever been 168 women elected? That's less than the entire legislature right now, which is 181 seats. Kind of heartbreaking. So for today's presentation, I will be taking you through the purpose of my research, as well as some key findings. I am thrilled to share with everyone here today why this topic is so important to me and why I see so much value in representation in our elected bodies. First, I would like to start with recognizing some of my own biases as a Latina doing research on politics and government, especially as someone who has been consistently involved, working for members, working for public policy organizations, and working from the local, state, and national level. I also wanted to point out, for the purposes of this research, the terminologies that I use to describe certain groups of people. For instance, I chose to use Hispanic rather than Latinx because this is how the census still organizes these particular group of individuals. These terms, at least for me, were a little bit unsettling, but I understand that they're a little bit outdated since it's the census. It's been going on for quite some time. So, for instance, I prefer to identify myself as Latina, but in this research, I'll be using Hispanic. I also wanted to point out before I get into my research that our elected bodies only just recently started becoming more diverse and representative. Particularly within my own lifetime, the past 20 years, have they become more diverse. There are communities to this day that still have no representation at all, even here in Texas. Particularly members of the LGBTQ+ community recently created a caucus during this 86th legislative session. They just now have a voice, and it's 2019. So now that I've covered my basis, we can get into it. Okay. So my interest for this project started when I was interning at Annie's List last spring. I recognized the fact that there were so many women stepping up to run, but also that there was still such a long way to go. I was inspired by the work that I was doing, but I was only even more passionate about getting women elected thanks to my time there. As I reflect on my experiences the past 4 years, I realized that I've worked in every single kind of office, literally, local, state, and federal, and I've only ever worked for men. I've never worked for a woman. So that made me a little frustrated, especially doing a project like this, where I wish I could have had that opportunity. Now, though I definitely got exposed to amazing women working in politics, it's not the same as seeing someone who was elected into a position. Which brings me to the purpose of my project, where I used data from current women in the Texas State Legislature and collected items based on their campaigns, their personal background, to help me identify patterns that supported their winning in their race. I also attempted to use this data to identify if there were any differences in approach that women of color took as opposed to races that white women took. So this is the current class of women in the 86th Texas House of Representatives. It's a pretty inspirational picture, at least for me it is. I try to look at it every morning, especially since I created it. I mainly chose to focus on the Texas House because of my proximity to it, one, but also largely because it was one of the largest pool of women that I could find, which is also sad. But I was blessed enough to be able to to be in such close proximity to them that I can gather information because I am in Austin. On this next slide, I identify all the women of color within our Texas state legislature. I made it a point in my research to put race and equity at the forefront of my data and the conversation. So this meant identifying and creating a space to discuss the intersectionalities between gender and race in campaigning to run for office. The reality is that the picture looks more like this, where women only make up 22.67% of the Texas House of Representatives. And although I do love looking at this picture every single morning, the stark reality is that this is what it really looks like. So, I go back to my main question. What does it take to win? So let's see. My method in conducting this research was based on a data analysis. I collected information and data available to the public that is already readily available through the Texas Legislative Council and research services. So this is all there, just no one had made sense of it, no one had put it together, and there was no way for me to identify individuals that I could reach out to because no one had ever talked about it. I also used my background and experience as a woman and a woman of color working in government spaces to identify literature, individuals, political powerhouses that I can interview, talk to, and understand that this data really does have more than just being a number. So for this first part, let's look at the class profile. So by age, we can see that Hispanic women are the youngest class in the Texas House of Representatives, next to African American women and Asian women. The next slide. By race, we are a majority-minority class. So the majority of the people or women in the Texas state legislature identify as racial or ethnic minorities. So the largest ethnic group is Hispanic women, followed by white women, then African American, and then Asian. I'd also like to point out that there is only one Asian in this study, which could skew a few of my results, but I think her story is actually particularly fascinating, so I was very fascinated by having her included in this data. So when we look at occupations, it's no surprise that most of them have been involved in the legal field. As you can see, there are almost more than half involved in the legal field. The rest are involved in businesses, and there are a few that are involved in education, healthcare, and even a few authors. There's some great writers here too. There are 3 women in particular that have no occupation, meaning that during the state legislature, or before, or after, they just hold no occupation. That can largely be because they are independently wealthy, and they can afford to not work while being in office, or while not being in office. So this is the party affiliation. Most women identify as Democrats, and then there are a handful that identify as Republicans. So this is where this Asian woman comes back into place. Like I said, her story is very fascinating to me. She's actually identified as a Republican, so she's the only minority that identifies as a Republican in our Texas state legislature. So now we get to the fun part, where what I like to call is the winning approach to winning a campaign. So after I collected all this data, I identified 3 main pillars to the success of women running for office. Although this doesn't encompass everything that has to do with campaigns, because campaigns are so insanely complex, I feel like for the most part, things can fall under these pillars, like district, messaging, and money. So I'll start with my favorite, the money. So we know that campaigns are really expensive, but I never imagined them to be this expensive. Like, this is a lot of money. The average cost of a campaign is around $47K. Hispanic women spend $59K, Asian women $47K, which is pretty on average. African American women spend the least amount on their campaigns, and white women spend a little bit above the average. But what I particularly like to point out is their donation amount and how high their donations are. As we can see, white women receive larger donations as opposed to African American women, Asian women, and Hispanic women. When talking to experts about this particular data, we were able to identify that women of color to this day still struggle with asking for money and asking for donations, which I can attest to. As a woman of color, it is really hard to encourage yourself, encourage your friends, to ask for money. It's not a cultural practice that we have done for generations. It's easier for white women, regardless of the fact that they are women, to break that barrier because there's not that added layer of race. where they don't see you as a person first, they see you as your color first. So I thought that was a very interesting statistic, and I'm glad I was able to bring that to light. So in general, some other key takeaways is that women of color tend to raise less money, but spend a lot more money on their campaigns. African American women raise and spend the least amount of money on their campaigns. Hispanic women spend the most. White women raise above the average, and are second to Hispanic women on spending. The one Asian woman in my test raised the least amount of money and spent an average amount on her campaign. I'd also like to note that running for office has always been extremely expensive, but now seeing these numbers, especially with the inflation that we have today and the cost it is to do media and all these factors, can partially explain why it has gotten more expensive over the years. And although it is a tragic and sad reality, these are numbers, and hopefully we can use them to explain how we can help them in the future. Which leads me to my next point, district. So honestly, districts can either make it or break it for your campaign. The amount of money that you end up spending is largely dependent on how much you need to target in your constituency. So we look here at Representative Jovahana Thompson, who has had a 23-year term in the Texas House of Representatives. And when we look at her district population, I know it's a little hard to see, but we can see that she has a majority Black and Hispanic district, where Black people make up 49% and Hispanic individuals make up 41.2%. Overall, her district is close to 90% people of color. So she's been able to win year after year in her district. And even when she took a break to try running for Senate and lost, and went back to run for the Texas House, she was still able to win over her constituency. One, because of her large, strong ties to the community, but also because the community saw themselves in her, and it was easier for them to elect. So again, some other key takeaways that I took from looking at these districts is that women of color tend to run in districts that reflect their cultural identities. For instance, 8 out of 9 African American women are a majority Black and Hispanic districts, just like Representative Thompson. 4 out of 9 African American women are in completely dominant African American districts. 10 of 14 Hispanic women are a majority Black and Hispanic districts. And 9 out of 14 Hispanic women are in majority Hispanic districts. So as you can see, there is a larger number of women of color who run in places where people look like them, compared to white women, where only one white woman is in a majority Black district and Hispanic district. But again, they tend to run in districts that look like them and represent them. But I thought this was particularly interesting. 8 out of 9 white women are in majority Anglo districts, and that one Asian woman that I still talk about, she's very interesting to me, is in a majority Anglo district. But again, she also ran as a Republican. So again, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that in her district, the messaging was way more important than her race. The values that she identified with were that strong, and they identified so much with the community that they were willing to overlook her race because they matched up with what they believed in. Which brings me to my next important point, messaging. So here, we're able to see what's the common kind of messaging for Hispanic women running. They tend to highlight in their campaigns issues such as immigration, the environment, and property taxes, at least for this past midterm election. Here are the issues that the Asian woman focused on. Since she's the only one, the bubble was just really big, but these were the issues that she chose to focus on. And again, these align with the community that she ran with, and she was able to win. For African American women, they tend to focus on the criminal justice system, higher education, and surprisingly this past session, they focused a lot on mental health. Jovahana Thompson actually solely focused on mental health this past midterm election, which I thought was particularly fascinating. That might also tell us the more terms that you run, the more issue specific that you can get. Because I found with more women who were freshmen had a broader spectrum of issues that they cared about, but women who had been running for several years had a shorter list of issues that they chose to focus on. So that can tell us a lot about how we elect women year after year. For white women, these tend to be the issues that they focused on. And my major takeaways were that in general, women focused a lot on healthcare and education, which was not such a big surprise. It was kind of a theme that I've understood over the years of working at the legislature, that women were just always the go-to individuals to go to, particularly about healthcare, because that did also encompass women's issues, and they always were able to bring that to the table. Amongst women of color, higher education and transportation were some other top factors, which I thought was very interesting. Just some more messaging bubbles. So at the end of the day, what does it really take for women of color to run in Texas? Well, first, it starts with recognizing the barriers. I talked a lot about some of the numbers, and although there is more increasing participation of women of color, we still have to recognize that these barriers exist, such as asking for donations. Cultural barriers make it more difficult for women of color to, yes, fundraise for money, but also just encourage themselves to even run. It's still not a cultural practice for women of color to see themselves in a leadership position, for one, because they don't even see themselves to begin with. So it's really hard for them to break that glass barrier and be that person for someone else. But once they're there, I'm sure they can fly and help us out. The women in these seats currently, all of these seats, are all independently wealthy, even the women of color. They all either own businesses, they're lawyers, or they own their own company. So it's nice for them to be able to take off that one spring every 2 years to write public policy for the state of Texas. But not all women can do that. Some women do have to work several jobs to just support their family, and not all working class women can do this. So that's something that I understood. Also, another way that we can help break barriers for women of color is to create spaces that uniquely prepare African American women, Asian women, Latina women, and women of all other minority demographics to run for office. In my experience, I have found that a lot of these groups of individuals that do preparations for women to run for office tend to look at it very monolithically, like they're all run the same and they all need the same categories. For women of color, there's this added barrier that we have not yet talked about or figured out how to break. So although my research does not necessarily talk about how we can do that step by step, it does identify that this exists and that we should do something about it. Because I really do hope that I never have to see this number again. Thank you.
Questions, anyone? Questions?
Yes. So I'm curious if you found anything that explains the discrepancy between the cost of campaigning between like races. So you said like African American women had the lowest cost or the highest cost with the lowest like donations, right?
Right.
Did you find anything to explain that?
Yeah, I believe it was Hispanic women, not African American
Okay.
women. But what really happened here this past midterm election, with a few Hispanic women ran in really competitive districts. So I talked a lot about how that price can change based on the district that you run in. There were some members in particular that ran in districts where they were very competitive. They had like 6 people that they needed to be. This was even before they got to the actual like general election. It was all like during the primary part, which is when they're just kind of running for their seat. So in there, they already kind of like flooded out all the funds that they had and had to spend more money. One on just messaging, which can get really expensive. It's really nice when journalists write stories about members that are running, but for the most part, they have to spend a lot of money on websites, on social media engagement, and all these things that add up over time. So there were a few women, particularly in the Hispanic demographic, that spent around 6 figures on their campaigns because they ran in districts where they were super competitive and they probably weren't going to win if they hadn't had to spend that much money. Good question, yeah. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, isn't gerrymandering a way of concentrating demographically people in the same district? Is that having an effect on these women being elected? Anything you want to say about gerrymandering?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about gerrymandering. That's like a really big topic and question, and I know that the legislature has been trying to work on that. Their calendars committee in particular has been working on that for a few years, but it kind of ends up always being like under the rug for the most part because there's so many other issues that they try to tackle. They kind of forget about this one. But in particular, I think this session, because the 2020 census is coming up, that plays a huge role in how we end up districting one our congressional seats, but also our legislative seats in the Texas House. So you're correct. Like gerrymandering usually does help, in my experience and what I've researched, usually does help certain individuals win in certain spaces. And it is something that the Texas House has been trying to tackle because it has affected the way that our bodies have been diverse or lack that diversity. So hopefully this time around, because the 2020 census is coming and people want to see those numbers being counted, that will work out really. Yes.
I'm curious to know your thoughts on like the effect of the rise of like social media and technology, because it does increase like the cost, but also the like information, people have more access to information. So do you think that weighs out for like women of color and women running, or do you think that it's like hurting them?
Well, in Texas it's a little bit different because we don't have like online voter registration. In fact, everything is still done through paper.
Yes.
That still affects the way that we reach our audience, especially like older audiences that don't really have access to a lot of social media or tend to not be on social media. Younger individuals, and usually people under 18, are the ones that like have this really large like social media presence. Millennials do as well, and we tend to have the ability to make things viral if we want them to, and that does help our generation, but it doesn't help older generations. Those generations still need the paper advertisements, the TV, the radios, and those kinds of outreach methods in order to reach, because it's just how our voting system works. And for younger people such as ourselves, because we actually have to go to a place, get out of our room, and like go vote, and sometimes we don't know that, we still have to struggle with that because we don't have like an online voter registration system and we can't vote online unless some other states, which is hopefully something that Texas will change within the next couple of years.
So do you think in Texas it's like kind of hurting women of color running because they have to advertise to millennials and like that generation through electronic means, but also through like paper traditional route, and so the funding is like spread really thin?
Correct. I think in general it just harms everyone running for office.
Okay.
But women of color in particular, because they have to spend so much money in other areas of their campaign, that might be a factor. But I don't have a correct, I'm completely 100% sure about that. These are my inferences.
Cool.
Yes.
Given the work you did at Annie's List and the barriers you noticed in your research, what are groups like Annie's List and other groups doing to help women of color run more women of color?
Sure. And I've noticed this throughout the years that I've watched Annie's List since I've left. So they've done a really good job at doing trainings. So they do like Run to Win trainings, Canada 101 trainings. And I noticed that they started them doing a little bit more towards like the weekend. So they make it more available for working class women who don't have time during the week to go out on the weekends and learn how to run a campaign. And in general, I think Annie's List has done a pretty good job at reaching out to women who are just interested in running, but haven't been able to convince themselves to run. I think that's probably the hardest part right there, and I think that's where Annie's List does a really good job at intervening and saying, hey, you can run for office, and if you're willing to work with us, we can support you in this way. And I've seen that also from other groups such as like Emily's List, who tend to support women also running for office, but on a national scale. I saw that a lot with Annie's List with the Lupe Valdez race and how they came in and helped out. So I really appreciated that. And in general, this past midterm election was a huge, Annie's List was a huge key player for some really competitive races. I thought like the first thing that comes to mind is Victoria Neava's race and how competitive that race was and how important Annie's List was to getting her re-elected into the seat that she was already in.
Great answer, thank you. Dr. Long has a presentation.
I'd like to say a couple of things real quick. First, I think there are two things that make a great scholar. Number one, you have to be smart. Her intellect is self-evident. Two, you have to be disciplined. And she had a prestigious internship in Washington, D.C. last semester. She's been interning this semester. She does, those of you who are friends know she does a ton of activities on campus. And your ability to stay focused on this project while you have all those other things going on is very impressive to me. And then the second thing I'd like to say is that I really admire you for choosing a topic that's rooted in things that are important to our daily lives. Sometimes as academics we can do these esoteric studies that are intellectually satisfying but don't impact people's daily lives. And like you, I think if our legislative bodies could more and more reflect the extraordinary diversity of our country, we're going to be better off as a citizen. I think this kind of research really is a roadmap for future women of color who wants to walk in the halls of power and influence the course of our country. So I tip my hat to you as a fellow scholar. I think this has really done excellent work.
Yeah.